And I would now like to invite the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brendan Nelson, to the lectern.
Thank you, Craig. No, you won't actually. We'll start the ceremony, and once we have done the national anthem, then I will present what we're about.
Thank you. Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Craig Burrell, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Colonel Stephen Hume. We welcome Mr. Peter Everly, President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, ACT branch. We also welcome the trainees of HMAS Harmon. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony around Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From New South Wales, St Philip Christian School, Narara, and from Victoria, St Joseph's Primary School, Black Rock. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremony unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. Please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult party, attention! Catapult party, present! Arms.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is earth by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every state advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult party, shoulder, arms.
Boys and girls, please be seated. I would now like to invite the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brendan Nelson, to the lectern. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Craig. Today, as Australians and global citizens, we pause here at the Australian War Memorial and places of commemoration throughout our country and in other parts of the world to remember one of the most significant events in history and certainly in Australia's history. 75 years ago today, on the 15th of February 1942, Fortress Singapore, as it was known under the previous control of the British, fell to imperialist military Japan. The most significant year in Australia's history, by any standard, is 1788. The arrival of the First Fleet, its devastating impact upon the first Australians, but from it the origins of the Australia we are and the people we have become. The next most important year was 1942, and the most important event in that year we commemorate today. The British and Commonwealth forces fought desperately to defend Singapore. The Japanese had landed on the Malay Peninsula on the 7th of December 1941 as they simultaneously bombed the US fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Such was the desperation of the young Australians who fought across the Malay Peninsula in the defence of Singapore that 1,789 Australians were killed, 1,306 were wounded, 880 died in the very last week of the defence of Singapore itself, and General Yamashita, commanding the Japanese troops, and General Percival, commanding the British and Allied forces, signed the surrender on the 15th of February on a table which is proudly displayed in the galleries here at the Australian War Memorial. At the surrender of Singapore, 15,000 Australians immediately went into Japanese captivity, most of them at the Changi prison. Over 7 weeks, 22,000 Australians would be imprisoned. 8,000 of them would not survive the brutal incarceration that so many endured at the hands of the Japanese, and those that returned to Australia would never be the same. Australia's wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin, said upon the fall of Singapore that this was the gravest hour in Australia's history. He said, "On it depends the fate not only of the Commonwealth, but of the United States of America, and indeed all of the Americas, and therein the entire British-speaking world. The protection of this country," he said, "relies no longer just on our contribution to a world at war, but resistance to an enemy threatening to invade our shore." From the events that occurred this day, 75 years ago, 4 days later, the first of 100 attacks on the Australian mainland, with the bombing in 2 waves of Darwin, 265 dead. The gripping struggle at Kokoda, Ishiwava, the repulsion of the Japanese at Milne Bay, the Battle of Guadalcanal, Midway, Coral Sea, where the alliance between Australia and the United States was forged. And from a personal perspective, on the day of the surrender, Sergeant John Neville of the 2nd 10th Field Regiment said this: "The most lasting memory of the fall of Singapore was the terrific silence following the ceasefire order. The din of firing, bombs falling and exploding, and general noises of war had become normal for us. When it suddenly ceased, the silence seemed to hurt. One felt as though we were alone in a secluded forest glade with all the bird sounds and noises muted. It had never entered my head there should be such a thing as surrender. I never thought about being a prisoner. On the previous Wednesday, we'd all been told that we had to fight to the last man. Such is the discipline. Through long training, this does it to you. And long training we had during 12 months in Malaya before the action started. To hear we had capitulated left us dumbfounded." These events we remember today have had an enduring impact on our world. Australia's place in it, our alliance with the United States, its presence in the Western Pacific, and our very deep bilateral ties with the people of Singapore. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Charles Stanley Buchanan. Born on the 22nd of September 1924, Charles Buchanan, known as Chicka, was the eldest son and the second of 5 children born to Roy Stanley Buchanan and Pearl Eileen Buchanan. He had 3 sisters, as well as a younger brother who was born after he died. Roy Buchanan was a veteran of the First World War, wounded during the Third Battle of Ypres in October 1917. Roy was blinded in one eye. Roy was unable to enlist for service in the Second World War, and young Charles, determined to help out, lied about his age in order to do so. When he enlisted in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force on the 18th of October 1941, he had only just turned 17, but gave his age to the recruiting officers as 19. Following Japan's entry into the war on the 7th of December 1941, Buchanan was sent to Malaya and posted to the 2nd 19th Battalion, 8th Division. From mid-January 1942, the units of the 8th Division were involved in fierce fighting against the Japanese forces on the Malay Peninsula. By the beginning of February, the British and Commonwealth forces had been pushed back to the island of Singapore, and Japanese forces began landing on Singapore Island. On the 15th of February, the final day of fighting before the ceasefire was called, Buchanan was killed in action. He was 17 years old. Buchanan was one of almost 1,800 Australians killed in the month-long campaign in Malaya and Singapore, and one of almost 900 Australians killed in just 1 week of fighting on Singapore. Reported as missing in action, it would be some years before the Buchanan family was informed officially of Charles's death. While still listed as missing, his younger brother Clyde was born in December 1943. His family may have yet held out hope that Charles was still alive, perhaps captured as a prisoner of war. Buchanan's body was not recovered from the battlefield. His name is listed on the Singapore Memorial at the Kranji War Cemetery and on the Roll of Honour on my left, along with the names of some 40,000 Australians who died in the Second World War. His photograph is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Charles Stanley Buchanan, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Catapult party, present! Arms.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult Party, our words, turn. Catapult Party, quick march.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, had thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. Thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial, and we wish you a very good evening.